Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Thomas Crane Public Library. Tonight, we are very excited to bring you Sacco Vanzetti 100 years later, which is sponsored by the Friends of the Thomas Crane Public Library. Before we get started, let me first introduce tonight's speaker. For the last 25 years, Christopher Daly has been lecturing all over New England on historical topics, who is formerly president of the Pembroke Historical Society and also chairman of the Pembroke Historical Commission. He has written various articles for local publications, and his first book, Murder and Mayhem in Boston, you can see it right here, Historic Crimes in the Hub, was published in 2015. We have a number of copies of that in the OCLN network, so if you want to place a hold on it, go one flight up, talk to a librarian. He holds a BA and MA from Bridgewater State University in political science and history. He is currently working as a history teacher in the Silver Lake Regional School District. Quite a list of accomplishments, and everyone, if you'll please join me in welcoming to the podium, Christopher Daly.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Just want to get a sense of the audience here. How many people are from Quincy? Here's what I want to hear. How many people are from Braintree? Oh, I thought that would be a large number too. As you know, it all started in Braintree. And it actually started a little bit over 100 years ago. It actually started in 1919, but the big thing was that robbery that happened in Braintree. And I have to tell you, I've been doing this lecture for about 25 years. This was my first one. Started out with the little slide projector, clicky, clicky. And this has evolved over the years. I've done quite a bit of research. It's you could say it's become somewhat of an obsession because it all happened around here. And I've been to all the sites, photographed them way back in the early 90s. Just as late as a couple years ago, I've been to where Vanzetti lived, where Sacco lived, you name it. And this lecture arose back in the early 90s. So when you see some of these things, you're going to see quite a range of dates here, just because I've been doing it so long. And it's kind of interesting because this whole time period, there's a lot of similarities. Do you think there's a lot of similarities with this time period? We're kind of in a boom period. The 20s was a boom. There was a great amount of what they call xenophobia, fear of immigrants. And there were terrorists. They didn't call them terrorists, though. They called them anarchists. And a lot of this has to do with the anarchists, and we'll talk about that quite a bit, too. So without any further ado, we'll get started here. So if there are any questions or comments, we can have a good discussion after the lecture. And I must apologize. I'm having some eye issues, so I have to stop in the middle of the lecture and wipe my eye. That's what I'm doing, just so you know. And let's get going. As I said, it's a little bit over 100 years. The first robbery that most people don't know about happened on December 24th, 1919 at 7:30 a.m. in Bridgewater. In that morning, it was kind of like this picture here. It was a light snow on the ground, covering the cars, the roads. They were slippery at the time. And what was going to happen that morning? This bank, this is Bridgewater Savings Bank. From this bank, $33,000 in cash was going to be moved by truck, a truck exactly like this, by these three gentlemen to the LQ White Shoe Factory to pay the help off. Do you believe they used to pay people in cash once upon a time, before the income tax really kicked in there? And what would happen is they'd bring the cash down and they'd spend the day in the offices filling the envelopes for the help, and then at the end of the day, the paymaster would issue the cash to the employees. Now, this is LQ White, as it was back then. Here's another picture. Do you believe they actually had postcards of factories back then? This is from a postcard. And this is the site today. Yes, it's a MBTA parking lot near the train station. And I took this just a couple of years ago. It probably looks exactly like that today. Back in 1992, when I was first investigating this case, I photographed the entire area, and there was still some evidence of L.Q. White here. These are the foundations of L.Q. White. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, I found the last soul at the L.Q. White shoe factory. Yes. Now, here's a map of Bridgewater. Here's about where the bank was. L.Q. White was down here. And all they had to do was load up the truck and take it down Broad Street here. And my pointer's not working too well. So, back then, you see where Route 18 is, Broad Street? There was also a streetcar line then, too. Somebody asked me the other day, how'd they get around then? And most people got around by these streetcars. They were all over the place. So the truck was to go from the bank and drop the payroll off at the L.Q. White shoe factory. This is probably what the street looked like back then. The tracks aren't in yet, but you can see by that car, it's around this date here. The tracks are in, you can see in the middle. At about Hale Street, just as the electric car was pulling away, some passengers had just boarded at Hale Street. The payroll truck was slowly moving down the street. And just as they got to about this point, a touring car roared in front of them, pulled into this street here, and these three men got out. Now here they were described by the witnesses as dark, swarthy, Italian-looking, as if they could tell they were Italian just by the way they looked. Two of the men were small, about 5'6". The other one was taller, 5'7". The one in the lead had a pump shotgun, and he kind of jogged out into the road. This is as the payroll truck is coming down the road. This is all in action here. And he aimed the shotgun and ordered the truck to stop. Now, the paymaster, the guard, hit the gas, and he swerved around that trolley that you saw just taking off from there, and he avoided these robbers. Actually, there was gunfire exchanged. The guard and the paymaster said they could hear the buckshot bouncing off the side of the truck. So nobody got shot, and they were able to evade these robbers. They were able to go around that trolley car, but they were going at such a high rate of speed that they ended up crashing down at the end of the street here into a telephone pole. So that was a close call. The bandits, after this whole thing happened, it happened probably within seconds, they realized that their opportunity was lost. They couldn't stop the truck. They jumped back into the car, and they took off. So this was an attempted robbery. Nobody was killed, except for, the truck there probably had some damage. That was about it. But this was something that was happening all over New England, these payroll robberies. Now, this is the evidence that was found. Let's look at the evidence. Winchester shotgun shells. Now, if you know anything about weapons, that tells you right there it's a pump shotgun because it was ejected out of the shotgun. It's not one of those breech loader things. And they were Winchester shotgun shells. This would play later on in the trial. Numerous eyewitnesses were able to describe the bandits. Many of them saw the man with the shotgun. They said that he was, again, dark, swarthy looking. They said he had a short, croppy, slightly graying mustache. And the other two in the back, they were shorter, they were dark too. One boy that was at the scene thought they were Greeks. And they said, well, why do you think they're Greeks? Well, they were running like Greeks. And I'm reading this. How does a boy know how Greeks run? Is there a special way or something? Now, other eyewitnesses were able to write down the license plate of the vehicle, and this comes into play later, as you'll see. Now, the investigation. L.Q. White puts out a $1,000 reward for any information leading to the capture of these robbers. And the Pinkerton Detective Agency is called in. This is the original private eye detective agency. And Chief Stewart of the Bridgewater police is on the case. Now, here's Chief Stewart. He was about 40 years old at the time of this robbery, and his experience in policing wasn't very vast. That's why they had to call in the Pinkertons, because I think the Bridgewater Police Department consisted of him, a night man, and a day man. And that was and they were basically used to breaking up fights in houses and hauling drunk people to jail. They were not used to murders. They were not used to high-profile robberies, so that's why they had to call in the professional detectives. But I think he wanted to be one of those guys, so he was in on it. He made sure he was in on every step of the investigation here. Now, they tracked down the license plate, and it turns out that it was one of two that was stolen from a garage in Needham, Hassam's garage in Needham. Now, the story was they went and Chief Stewart and the Pinkertons, and they talked to Hassam, and he said, yeah, there was this guy who showed up one day. He had a velour hat. He was dark, swarthy looking. He had a crop mustache, slightly graying. Does that sound familiar? And he wanted to borrow some license plates because he said he had to move a car that he had just bought. He didn't have a license plate for it. And Hassam said, no, I'm not going to let you do that. That's against the law. I can't do it. And the guy had kind of a fit, and he huffed off. Next day, he noticed that 2 of his license plates were stolen. So he figured it was that guy that came in looking for the license plates. And the license plates are very important in this case, as we'll see in a little bit. So that was their first bit of information. Then they fanned out, and they went to all the bars and the pool halls where the criminal element would be with their ears out, trying to get informants about this. And they did. They came up with an informant. This informant said that he was in a bar room and he overheard this fellow named C.A. Barr, who had anglicized his name. His real name was Carmine Barrasso, say that he knew something about the robbery. And that's all they got. So they decided to stake out the C.A. Barr character. And this is where C.A. Barr lived, 31 Waverly Street, Brighton. He lived on the 3rd floor there. And the beauty of this is the actual original Pinkerton reports still exist, and you can read them. And they staked out C.A. Barr for 3 days, I believe. And they watched his every move. And it's interesting, you're reading about C.A. Barr's movement. He left at 7 a.m. He got on the train. He went to Boston. He stopped here. He stopped there. He stopped here. He stopped there. He stopped there. He stopped in numerous places all throughout the day. And I'm reading this thinking, I wonder what they thought he was doing. They didn't make any kind of speculation. Maybe that was against company rules. They didn't make any guesses. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, he's a bootlegger. Or he's some kind of bagman or something like that. Who does that? Now, years later, I actually came in contact with a descendant of the Barr family, and she said he was some kind of natural pharmacist in the Italian community or something, whatever that means. And she really knew nothing much about him either. So they decided to confront C.A. Barr. And they waited for him. They waited up in the landing of that 3rd floor apartment building there, and when C.A. Barr came up, he was described as about 5'7", dark, swarthy looking, short, croppy mustache, slightly graying. And they talked to him. They sat him down. He said, oh, yes, I know all about this. You see, I have this machine, and I looked into it, and I could see the robbery being committed. This is before television. Radio was still new. And I can imagine the detectives sitting there looking at each other going, cuckoo, this guy's nuts. And he went on, he said, the Mrs. Viteria, she lives in East Boston on Lexington Street. She looked into my machine, and she saw it was a gang of anarchists. And they wore disguises. And they live in a shack in Bridgewater. And then They drop the case and you never hear anything about C.A. Barr ever again. And the whole time, my whole thing about this case is, he was the shotgun bandit, and they didn't see it. He matched the description almost exactly, and he was able to throw them off because he came up with this cuckoo story about a machine that he could see the crime being committed. But a seed was planted here. Anarchists in a shack in Bridgewater. That seed was planted. And Stewart was on hand to see that. The Pinkertons were there. And even though they thought he was crazy, I think the seed was planted. I did find I've scoured the newspapers, gone through police records. I did find one inkling other than that lady I ran into a few years ago, about C.A. Barr. I would love to know who this guy was. This article I found, it seems he was caught on the subway putting slugs into the turnstile. Remember the slugs? And two policemen confronted him. And he pulled out vials of acid out of his pocket and threw in their faces. So this gives you a little insight into his personality. He was probably not an up-and-up person. He probably wasn't in the choir, the church choir. But we never hear about him ever again. This leads us to the big one, Braintree people. You're going to see some familiar sights here. South Braintree holdup, April 15th, 1920, 100th anniversary, is quickly approaching. And this robbery happened at 3 p.m. Here's the layout of what Pearl Street, this is the site of where the robbery happened. Here's the layout of what it looked like back then. It looks nothing like this today. And it's only 100 years. It looked nothing like this 25 years ago. It was all gone 25 years ago. I just want to point out some important buildings here. This is the Rice and Hutchins factory. This is where the robbery happened right here. Slater Morrill, one of the other two factories where the payroll was headed. You see up in the left-hand over here, you see here, this was called the Hampton House. Now this is where all the offices were for the factories. The payroll would be brought in there in the morning, and then the secretaries would count out the cash, like I told you earlier. And you see Pearl Street, and you have a railroad crossing here, and you have a water tank. So that's the scene. Let's look at South Braintree through the years. Here are some photographs that were taken right after this robbery. Now what you see is on the right, you see Rice and Hutchins, and in the distance that's Slater Morrill. The railroad crossing is there, and you see the water tower. This is Pearl Street. And if we had the capacity to pan to the left, you'd see the Hampton House right over here. That's what it looked like in 1992. All gone, pretty much. Now here's a close-up on the Rice and Hutchins factory, Pearl Street. So we're looking towards the Rice and Hutchins factory. The railroad crossing is up here. And 1992, this is all that was left. That rail fence is very important. That will come into the case in a bit. Looking down, here's Rice and Hutchins on the right, Slater Morrill, the water tower. Now I took this picture in 1992. The only thing that was left here is that house in the distance that you see. And even that's gone now. And here is the Hampton House. And I took this just a few years ago. Gone. And here's another shot of Rice and Hutchins. Here's a shot I took just a couple years ago, if I was standing in the same position. That's what it looks like. It's a strip mall, yes. And here is the railroad crossing. This is what it looks like today. It's an overpass now. So it doesn't look at all like it did 100 years ago. All right. Let's start the story here. It actually started, our story on that day starts at 9:18 a.m. The payroll was supposed to be there at 9 o'clock, but the train was running late. Shelley Neal, who was the American Express office attendant agent, was in this office right here. And his job was to go to the railroad station and pick up that payroll. It was about $15,000. Here's the railroad station later in the 1950s. Now, believe it or not, he actually had a horse team and a buckboard. That's how he was going over. And they took those boxes off of the train, they bolted them to the floor of the buckboard, and they went back to the Hampton House. Now, he pulled up right about here, and Shelley Neal would later remark that he noticed that there was something wrong that morning. Number one, there were two cars over here, kind of nose to nose, and there was a fellow right about where that person is, right in that picture, just kind of loitering around at 9:18 in the morning. He was described as tall, pale, blonde, sickly looking, like he had tuberculosis or something, and he was wearing a World War I trench coat and one of those, caps, one of those Irish caps. And he was kind of just leaning up against the wall with his hands down into his jacket, kind of just kind of hanging around. Shelley Neal, and he had another man with him, they had these payroll boxes, and they're walking by. I guess Neal had one hand free, and he would later remark, as I was walking by this fella, I put my hand in my pocket on my pistol. I think he thought he was about to be robbed. As he's walking by this fella, he looked up and they made eye contact. Now, the man against the wall just kind of looked up, they made eye contact. Neal and the other man got into the American Express office. He ran upstairs to one of those windows just to find out what's this guy doing? Who are those people in those cars? And one of the fellas yelled, "Let's go!" And the blonde man jumped in one of the cars, and the two cars just left. Now, what they were probably doing was making sure that the payroll had arrived. As I told you, there were these payroll robberies all over New England, and what the Rice and Hutchins and Slater Morrill was doing was they were alternating paydays, so to throw off anybody. They didn't know when the payday was going to be, so they were there to make sure that the payroll was there. Now, throughout the day, these men, there were described as 4 or 5 men, were seen around Braintree. In this car, this is the getaway car that was later found after the robbery. At various locations, they were seen at the railroad station smoking under the non-smoking sign. You would think in the 20s they would have that. They were seen at the drugstore. They were seen outside of Slater Morrill with one of them underneath trying to fix it because it looked like there was something wrong, or they were pretending there was something wrong with the engine. A woman by the name of Lola Andrews actually asked one of them where the employment office was for Rice and Hutchins, and she said in a clear American accent, he said, "Over there," and pointed her there. Here's another shot of it. These were taken up in Boston behind the State House. So it's kind of odd that people would see, because this is a factory town, and if you're not in the factory working, you stick out like a sore thumb. Because people weren't outside the factories, even for smoke breaks, because they were doing piecework. And if you got off your machine, you were losing money. They ate at their machines, they smoked at their machines, so people wandering around the street were very noticeable. And this brings us to about 3 o'clock, just before 3 o'clock. The paymaster and his guard, Frederick Parmenter from Brockton, Alessandro Baradelli from Quincy, 5-minute drive from here, went up to the top floor. They chatted with the secretaries who had been filling those envelopes all day. And normally what they'd do is go down here, get in a truck, and drive down. But it was April. It was one of the first spring days. And they thought, what a great day for a walk. And they decided to walk the payroll down to the factories. It would be the last walk of their lives. They crossed the crossing here. The gate tender, whose name was Mike Lavangi, waved at them. They waved back. And here's the street again. This is a later photograph, probably in the 40s or 50s. And they started making their way down the Rice and Hutchins. They ran into a fellow by the name of Jimmy Bostock. He was a mechanic. He was coming up from one of the factories. He said he had a job over in Brockton, had to get on the streetcar, go over there. He would later be one of the main witnesses to the shooting. And they got to right about this spot, and there were two men just kind of leaning on that fence you see there, sticking out like sore thumbs. Like I said, people milling around the factory. This was unknown. And Baradelli was on the right, Parmenter was on the left. They're in the middle of the road. Both of them have payroll boxes in their hands. And as they pass these men, one of the men jumps off the fence, grabs Baradelli. Some witnesses said they thought he said something to Baradelli, popped 2 shots in the back. Baradelli went down to his knees. Parmenter's standing over here and begins to run. According to most witnesses, the same shooter took 2 shots at him, hit him once in the back, I should say, which flipped him around, and then fired again and hit him in the chest. He went down in the gutter across the street. Now, at this point, Baradelli is still on his knees. He's trying to struggle to get back up. And the shooter moves around in front of him. So if you can imagine, Baradelli's on his knees trying to get back up, and the shooter's standing over him, aiming the pistol up into the windows, because people are starting to stick their heads out of the windows, see what's going on. As Baradelli's about to get up, most eyewitnesses say he popped 2 shots that went right into the shoulders, down into the back. Baradelli went into the gutter. And then fired another shot, and then the getaway car came chugging up the street, grinding gears. Maybe it had been misfiring or something, and got up to where the robbery happened. Now, this is where we get a different version. There were 1 or 2 witnesses that said there was a man on the running board that jumped off the getaway car, walked up to Baradelli, and fired 1 shot. Most of the witnesses say there was 1 person doing all the shooting. Now, they threw the payroll in the car and roared off down Pearl Street. People are starting to come out in the street now, and they're hanging out the windows, pointing guns at people. People are diving for cover, and they actually threw tacks out the back window. This is like the Keystone Cops. Like, if anybody follows, they'll get a flat tire. And it said that they roared, and at the end of Pearl Street, they made a left-hand turn on 2 wheels. They were going so fast. Right through the gate tender actually had the gate down, and they pointed the gun at him. So what was the evidence left at the scene? Spent semi-automatic pistol shells. Somebody was firing a semi-automatic, not a revolver. A man's cap was supposedly found at the scene. Now, here are the bullets. These are the actual bullets. These are the 2 that were taken out of Parmenter, and these are the 4 bullets that were taken out of Baradelli. So those were all logged into evidence too. And numerous eyewitnesses were there and described these people, and they wrote down the license plate number. Guess where it was stolen from? Needham, the Hassam's garage, right. So they linked these 2 robberies because of the license plate. It must have been the same gang, they thought. So we're looking for the same gang of hoodlums. Now, this is the getaway route. Braintree's up here on the left. They avoided all the major population areas. They went through the back roads of Randolph, came through the back roads of Brockton. And as you can see here, on this map, there were several people that saw the getaway car. And they saw it because it was going at the high rate of speed of 50 miles an hour. Now, you can imagine these dusty roads, and 50 miles an hour back then was pretty fast. Now, the witnesses lose contact with the getaway car, but we know that the getaway car is later found in Manley Woods, which is, if you know the West Bridgewater, Brockton. Do you know where the Brockton Fairgrounds are? If you were to walk through the woods, you'd end up in West Bridgewater. Manley Woods is that area next to the Brockton Fairgrounds. There were 2 men out riding horses, and they came across this abandoned car out there. Well, the police were called in, And the license plate matched. It was the getaway car from Braintree. Police Chief Stewart was on hand, and they examined the car. There was a bullet hole in it. They found a vial in the back seat, and they surmised that the vial had contained cocaine. Stewart was looking at the car. He looked it over, and he remarked, this is a quote, he said, "These men knew no God." You know what that tells me? He's thinking anarchists. Because most anarchists were atheists. Even at this early stage, he's thinking anarchists. Now, speaking of anarchists, what was going on in 1920, 1919? Something called the Red Scare. Well, what happened during World War I? There was a huge upheaval in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution. The communists took over. Here's Vladimir Lenin. And in America, we were deathly afraid. We were deathly afraid that we were going to have something like that happen over here, that these Reds were going to take over the country, just like they did in Russia. Now, Reds was kind of a generic term for political radicals. Anybody that was a communist, you were a Red. If you were a socialist, you were a Red. Or an anarchist, you were a Red. Funny thing about anarchists, they have nothing to do with the first two. Can you think of modern libertarians? They believe that government shouldn't have anything to do with your life and leave you alone, essentially, except for have a police force and an army. That's like a really hardline libertarian. Anarchists were much the same. They believed that there should be no government, no bosses, no capitalism, that there should be just small groups of people that agree to work with each other peacefully. And they believed if you got rid of all the money, the judges, the lawyers, the corruption, the governments, that would automatically happen. And they really believed in this dream. Now, the communists and socialists, communists thought that you could get to that point, but you had to have a socialist government take over and basically re-educate everybody. The anarchists wanted it right away. And this is what happened in America that kicked off this Red Scare. There were these mail bombs that were sent out in the mail to all these people. These are the leading capitalists, industrialists, government official, judges. You'll see Rockefeller. You'll see J.P. Morgan up there. Mail bombs were sent to all these people. Almost nobody got hurt. So most of them were intercepted. The only person to get hurt was one of these industrialists received a package, and his maid opened it. It blew her arms off. She did survive, but it blew her arms off. She was the only victim. Somebody that these supposed anarchists would care about because they cared about the workers and the little guy, right? They didn't think that maybe J.P. Morgan didn't open his own mail. Kind of foolish. And then we have U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. This is his house. On June 2nd, 1919, it was just a regular day. They were investigating these mail bombs in the Department of Justice, of course. And he was ready to turn in for the night. His wife was up. She was reading. He got his favorite book. He nestled next to her on the bed. And then all of a sudden, ba-boom! The front of his house gets blown off. This is what it looked like, the damage. Well, here's what happened. This man is Carlo Baldinolfi, and he was one of the anarchists, and he was involved in the mail bombs too. He had a special bomb for Palmer that he was walking up that walkway to plant it on his front porch. Would have blown the whole house down. But before he could get to the porch, he tripped on the seam, fell on it, blew himself to bits in just a little bit of Palmer's house, some shattered glass. They found bits of him on the roof, They found his scalp on another roof. I think it was the Secretary of Navy. Oh, what was his name? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yeah. And they found also, they found these flyers. He was carrying a whole pack of flyers with him that he was probably going to leave after he blew up Palmer. And this is a copy of one of them. It was called Plain Words. And this is basically a diatribe against capitalism and the government and big money and corporations and how they abuse the working man. Signed, Anarchist Fighters. This really set things into high gear. Now the government was going to start looking for these people and they were going to start deporting them. And they put this guy on the case. This was his first case, young J. Edgar Hoover. He wasn't the director yet, and it wasn't even the FBI yet. It was just the Bureau of Investigation. And he was put on the case to track down all these evil Reds and send them out of the country. They found out pretty soon that this group of anarchists was one that was focused in New York and Boston, and they were led by this guy. His name was Luigi Galliani. And he ran the group. It was called Gruppo Autonomo. That's Italian for the autonomous group. And they published a newsletter that went out, and they had a mailing list. So the FBI got a hold of a mailing list, and they knew all the anarchists. So they started rounding them up and shipping them out. Here you go. This is a cartoon from the period. Yeah. And these are photographs of the government. These people were given no trial at all. They just showed up on their doorstep, put them in cuffs, threw them on a boat, and sent them to Russia. That's how they did things back then. Here's one of the ships they sent. They called it the Soviet Ark. A little cartoon. Yeah. Now, most of these people that they rounded up, they were not American citizens. All the ones that they rounded up were not American citizens. You could not do this to an American citizen. They were just foreign nationals that were here. So to the government, they had no rights. They could just throw them on a boat and ship them back. And most of them didn't even come from Russia. A lot of them came from Italy, France, other countries. And here's a short clip of people actually being taken out of their house. Emma Goldman was probably the leading anarchist at the time. There's a shot of her being let off. Here's the police. Bye. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were the head anarchists back then. And this was going to solve our problem. Yep. Yeah. See you later. Now, they were able to trace the flyers to Gruppo Autonomo because they found out that these flyers were printed here in Brooklyn by two printers, Robert Elia and Andrea Salcedo. And they found out about a lot of the other information about this Gruppo Autonomo because they arrested these two. They brought them to Park Row up in Boston, up in New York City. This is the federal building, and interrogated them for 2 weeks. Now, on May 3rd, 1920, one of them, Andrea Salcedo, fell out the 15th window. Now, I think probably from what I've read and what I can tell you what probably happened was they forced him to give up all of his friends. And he felt so guilty that he did commit suicide. On the outside, the anarchists outside saw that one of their comrades was arrested, and they thought that the federal government probably threw him out the window. So they were panicking. They're like, well, they're not just deporting us now. They're throwing us out windows. They're out to kill us now. Here's the headline. So the ones that were still out there were still a lot of anarchists out there. Sacco and Vanzetti were among them. Started to go underground. They started to collect any dynamite they had, any literature, and they were going to go underground and hide till this stuff blew over because of this, because they thought that they could be murdered by the police. This brings us to a shack in Bridgewater. Remember that? CA bar shack in Bridgewater? There was an anarchist by the name of Faruko Kawachi who lived here, and he was due to be deported on April 15th, 1920. He did not show up for deportation. The Department of Labor, who was in charge, believe it or not, Department of Labor was in charge of deporting all these people, contacted Chief Stewart and said, we're suspicious about this Kawachi. Can you go out and find out what's up with him? And Stewart said, oh, well, I can't do it today. I'm rehearsing for a play I'm going to be in. I'll send my man Brouillard out to see Kawachi. So Brouillard arrived at the shack in Bridgewater. Let's see, do I have a, oh, this is Chief Stewart. Arrived at the shack in Bridgewater, and he talked to Kawachi. And Kawachi told him this cock and bull story about how his wife was sick, and he had to stay back and take care of her. Meanwhile, Brouillard's looking at her out of the corner of his eyes, and she looks perfectly fine. So he accepted this, and Kawachi said, I'm going to head out on the next boat. I'm going. I got my bags packed. And Brouillard goes back to Stewart, and he said, I think, quote, he said, there's something fishy going on over there, Chief. I think we should check it out a little bit further. And the next day, when he didn't have a play rehearsal, Chief Stewart decided to investigate himself, and he went over to this shack in Bridgewater, West Bridgewater, I should say, which was actually out of his jurisdiction, but I guess that didn't matter. And he knocked on the door. And this man came to the door. This is Mario Buda, also known as Mike Boda. He called himself Mike Boda. And he opened the door, and Stewart said, is Kawachi still here? Oh, no, he left. He got on the boat. He's gone. He wanted to find some way to get in. He said, do you have a photograph of him or anything? And Boda let him in. The thing is, Chief Stewart did not know who he was dealing with. This guy was probably one of the most rabid, violent anarchists of the group. He was probably one of the bomb makers. Because it's thought, most historians agree, that after Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested, there was an incident that happened on Wall Street. Maybe you've heard about it. They call it the first car bombing. Somebody took a carriage full of dynamite loaded with ball bearings, and at lunchtime set it off on Wall Street, blowing up, hitting hundreds of people. 30 people died, hundreds were injured. And it's thought that Mike Boda did this, and it was in retaliation for the arrest of Sacco and Vanzetti. This is in the future. This is later on I'm talking about. Here are some scenes from that bombing. And this is, when I went down there, I was able to look at the site. There's still evidence of that bombing. See the pockmarks on the wall? And when I was down there, I had my wife take my picture here, right there. And you know what? You know what's probably less than 100 yards in back of that building? Ground zero. Yeah. So it's kind of ironic. So back to Mike Boda and Chief Stewart. He didn't know who he was dealing with, and Mike Boda just let him in, and he said, so do you have a picture of this Kawachi? And as they were looking around the house, Chief Stewart said, hey, Mike, did Kawachi have a gun? Oh, yeah, I think he had a gun. He kept it in this drawer over here. He pulled out the drawer, and there was a diagram of the gun that Kawachi owned. A Savage automatic, semi-automatic pistol with a left twist. A lot like a Colt automatic. Then Chief Stewart looks at Boda and he says, do you have a gun? Oh, yeah, I have a gun. And he pulled out this thing. Yeah, it's an Austrian, semi-automatic. At this time, I'm reading this. I would have put the cuffs on him right there. It was not legal to even own a gun without a permit back then. So he said, so why do you have a pistol? I'm a macaroni salesman. I carry a lot of money with me. I guess that was a good excuse. He was actually one of the biggest anarchists as a sideline. He was a bootlegger. Stewart had no idea who he was talking to. This is country police. So he asked him to take him further around, and he took him out to the garage here. And Stewart got into the garage, and he noticed that in the dirt floor of the garage, it looked like somebody had dug up the ground recently. Like somebody put money there. And there were tire tracks that he identified as Buick tire tracks. I don't know how you do that, but at this point, Stewart goes back to Bridgewater and doesn't arrest Boda. That's that house in 1992. The garage was still there. Here it is, I believe. Here's another shot of the garage. Here it is today. I was recently asked to work on a documentary for the Travel Channel, and myself and the producer went up to the house and knocked on the door, and the guy who was renting the house knew all about it but didn't want to let us in. I was kind of disappointed. But that is the shack in Bridgewater, also known as Puffer's Place. Well, let me go back to the shack here. Chief Stewart mulled it over. He got home. I don't think he was too quick. He got home to Bridgewater and he thought, maybe I should go talk to him again. Maybe I should bring that Mike Boda in. So he went back to the house. Mike Boda would later say he saw him coming up the front steps and he went out the back. And he never saw Mike Boda again. Mike Boda went into hiding, and after the Sacco and Vanzetti case and everything, he ended up back over in Italy, got arrested by Mussolini and thrown in jail. And then he got out because he ratted everybody out. So that gives you his character. So Chief Stewart thought he lost his opportunity here. And then he gets a call from Simon Johnson, who owned this garage here. Simon Johnson said to Chief Stewart, he said, hey, guess what, Chief? This guy left this old jalopy, this Overland, this piece of junk that I repaired. He left it in my garage, and he's never shown up to pay for it. And the chief said, what do you want me to do about it? Well, can I just sell the thing and get my money back from selling it? And he said, yeah, well, that's a good idea. Who is this guy? Mike Boda. And he said, you know what? Hold on to that thing, and if that guy shows up for that car, you give me a call. All right, I'll do that. All right. This brings us to May 5th, 1920. This is West Bridgewater. That's where the getaway car was found. That's where the shack was, Kawachi's house, Puffer's Place. Simon Johnson's garage that we just saw. And Simon Johnson lived just up the street here. Now, on May 5th, 1920, about 9 o'clock, he hears a knock on his door. And he comes to the door. And who's there? He looked in the yard, and there's this motorcycle with a sidecar. And at the door is Mike Boda and this other guy named Riccardo Orsiani. And Mike says, I need to pick the car up. And Simon looks at him and he says, it's 9 o'clock. I need it. It's an emergency. I need it. And he says, okay, I have to go get dressed. Can you wait out here for a minute? I got to go put my pants on. Okay, shuts the door. He goes to his wife. He goes, it's that Boda. I'm supposed to call Police Chief Stewart, but we don't have a phone. And he said, he comes up, what a smart guy, he comes up with this plan. He goes, all right, what I want you to do is go to the neighbors, and as you're going by Boda, tell them you're going over to get some milk. So his wife leaves the house, and she goes to the neighbors. She calls Chief Stewart. She can't get a hold of Chief Stewart because he's in the play that he was rehearsing for. And she gets the message through that Boda's at the house. Somehow the message gets through the police station. They find out later, they contact Brockton. So what happens is Stewart comes out, By this time, there's two men that have come up, and they're all standing on the edge of the property, away from the door. And Stewart comes up to the door, and Boda comes up the walkway, and he goes, I'll come back tomorrow. I don't really need it now. The plates are out of date anyways. And Simon Johnson's a little confused. And Boda hops into the sidecar, and Orchiana, and his wife would later say when she returned from getting the milk that she overheard in Italian, telephone. So they probably knew what they were up to, that they were calling the police, so they decided to scram real quick. And the call went out from Bridgewater. Somebody got the call, and they knew that they were heading to Brockton because these men were seen getting on a trolley car, a streetcar, at this location here, Sunset Ave, I believe, and they were heading into Brockton. So the police called up Brockton, and the message got skewed a little bit. It said that there were these men involved in trying to steal a car over in West Bridgewater, and they were on the trolley. The call came in about 10 o'clock to Officer Michael Conley, big strapping Irishman. He was having a turkey sandwich, and he didn't get to finish his dinner that night. And he hopped out the station door and ran down the street, and at this corner of Keith and Main, that trolley was making the corner. Just as it was making the corner, he grabbed the rail and he hopped on the trolley. And he looked into the back. There was nobody on the trolley except these two guys way in the back. You know who they were, right? And he approached them. And he said to the one with the mustache, he said, "What was you doing in West Bridgewater?" And he went, "We were visiting a friend of mine. His name's Poppy." And Conley said, "Poppy, who?" "I don't know, Poppy wears a blue shirt. I used to work with him at the cottage in Plymouth." And meanwhile, Sacco was just sitting there. And Conley brought them to the station, and he arrested them as having been suspicious characters. Now, can you imagine if you went into Brockton today, how many people do you think you could pick up as suspicious characters? Nothing against Brockton. No, I worked there for years. We know these two men were Sacco and Vanzetti, and they were brought here. Now, when I was doing my research years ago, I kept coming to this address, and I'm like, that's a fire station. Well, and I realized that back in the 1920s, the early times, people were economical, and this was a fire station and a police station. And they brought them in there, and they held them for a short period of time, maybe in this cell here that's still in the back of the fire station. And then what it said is the police records say they brought up the machine, which was the big police paddy wagon. And they put Sacco and Vanzetti into the paddy wagon. Now, what happened was during all this, Conley would later say that he fished them. I guess that's what they used back then for frisking somebody. He said, "I fished Vanzetti, and I found a .38 caliber Harrington and Richardson revolver, and he was carrying Winchester shotgun shells. The revolver was fully loaded. I fished Sacco, and I didn't find anything." And this is as they're riding in on the trolley car. And he would remark at the trolley, he would say that Sacco was sitting there with a funny look on his face. He had a big overcoat on. And he kept like making motions like he was trying to get his hand into his coat. And Conley said, "If you want to make it to the police station, you better move your hand out of there, mister." When they got him to the police station, they found out that he had a .45 automatic Colt pistol and 32 rounds of ammunition. I guess Conley didn't fish him very well the first time. So he sounds like he was trying to make a move for the pistol. He would deny that in court. They were brought here to the police station, and they were separated, and then they were questioned. Vanzetti was questioned in one room, Sacco the other. Now, the district attorney was there, the police, and Chief Stewart came on board to question Vanzetti. They asked him a series of questions. Questions like, where were you on April 15th, 1920? And he said, "I was probably selling fish. I'm a fish salesman in Plymouth." "Okay. Are are you with the Black Hand? You know what the Black Hand is? It's like early word for the mafia or the Italian gang. And he kind of giggled and went, no, 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 no. And then they said, are you an anarchist? And he said, I like some things different. Not a real good answer. And then they said, do you know Mike Boda? Oh, I never heard of him. Lie. Where'd you get this gun? Oh, I got this up at the north end. Where'd you get this ammunition? I bought a box of ammunition. All lies. He bought this actually from another guy someplace else. This is the Harrington and Richardson revolver he was carrying. He said he was carrying that because he and Sacco were going to go into the woods the next day and do some target practice. They asked him about the Winchester shotgun shell in his pocket. And he said he just had that. He was just carrying it around. He didn't own a shotgun or anything. Do you remember what the shotgun shell was in Bridgewater? Winchester shotgun shell. Then they brought Sacco in, and here's the pistol he was carrying. They asked him pretty much the same questions, and his response was that he was a shoe trimmer. He worked for the 3K shoe factory in Stoughton, Massachusetts. He actually lived right next door to the factory, was very friendly with the owner, and carried the pistol because he was somewhat of a night watchman. He didn't say anything about going out to shoot with Vanzetti or anything like that. He was carrying 32 rounds of ammunition in his pocket. He was also, I believe he was, Vanzetti was also carrying literature about going out to make speeches. He was asked if he knew Mike Boda. He said, no, I don't. Lie. So they lied several times. They said, are you an anarchist? No, I'm not an anarchist. Now, later on, they would say in their minds they were afraid that the police were going to kill them because they were anarchists. So they lied about that. But there were a lot of other things they lied about that had nothing to do with being anarchists. Then they were arraigned. And then finally, there was two trials. Vanzetti was the only one put on trial for the Bridgewater robbery. He was identified as being the shotgun bandit, the one with the mustache. And it was held here in the Plymouth court. The judge was Judge Webster Thayer, and the district attorney was Frederick Katzman. They would be the judge and the district attorney on the second trial as well, even though it was two different counties. And this was a pretty quick trial. The prosecution case was, well, they lied under questioning. Sacco also said he wasn't, when they asked him, I forgot to mention this about Sacco. Where were you on April 15th? He said he was at work. They found out he wasn't at work. So they lied under questioning in the police station. Vanzetti, although he didn't have a shotgun, he had the Winchester shotgun shells, and they were found at the scene. There were witnesses that identified him as being the shotgun bandit at that first robbery. Now, the eyewitness testimony was challenged by the defense because they got a hold of the original Pinkerton reports and they read them, and it said that the man had a short, croppy, slightly graying mustache. And they said to the jury, does that look like a short, cropped mustache? And then the prosecution tried to make it seem like he had just grown it out since then. So they brought in his barber, and they also brought in a policeman from Plymouth to say that he'd always had this big walrus-type mustache. So the ID on the witness ID was very shaky. And the defense was simple. He was a fish peddler, and this robbery happened the day before Christmas. Anybody Italian? What do you eat the day Christmas Eve? Fish. Everybody in the north of Plymouth came to testify that Vanzetti sold him some fish that day. Almost everybody. Most of them had to speak through interpreters. There was one boy that took the stand, and he was a teacher here in Quincy. It comes to mind. Beltran Nobrini. Did anyone know him? Anybody have him? Yes. 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 I believe he's no longer with us. Beltrando Brini, for till the day he died, said he was with Vanzetti, helping him hand the fish out on the fish wagon there. This is him. That's Beltrando Brini right there, to the day he died. And there's North Plymouth. Now, what happened? Vanzetti also, under advice of his attorneys, refused to take the stand. And I know they say just plead the fifth, and the jury's not supposed to take that as anything. They're humans. Why is he not testifying? So he refused to take the stand, which probably was not a good idea. Vanzetti was convicted, sentenced to 15 years, which was extremely harsh even for then. And here's the evidence. The Winchester shotgun cells. There was a Winchester shotgun cell found on the road in Bridgewater. Now, there were no forensics like today. It could have been one of many thousands of Winchester shotgun shells. Shaky eyewitness testimony. They originally said in the original documents he had a short, croppy mustache. Vanzetti did not have that. He lied under questioning with the police. So he was convicted. Now he goes into the second trial as a convicted felon. Does not look good. This is the big one that we all heard about. The one in Dedham. Here's a photograph. Now, they were really nervous that there was going to be some kind of massive anarchist attack. And they had mounted patrols going around the courthouse. They actually had to stop people at the door and frisk them to see if they were carrying weapons. This is something we do all the time now, right? Here's the courthouse today. And they were usually brought in this door. This is the side door. And I use this photograph because that's where they're coming in right here. By this time, this was a massive cause célèbre. All over the world, people knew about this case. The word had gotten out. Why? Because a defense committee was formed and they raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they hired a guy by the name of Fred Moore, who would be their attorney, who was a great propagandist. He got the word out about this, made them the poster boys for anarchists and Italians, but he was a horrible lawyer. So here are the folks that are at the trial. Judge Webster Thayer asked to be on this trial. He said that he wanted to show that he could be fair and impartial in the face of all this prejudice and bigotry against Italians and anarchists. Fred Katzman, also, I guess he served both Plymouth County and Norfolk County. They really saved money back then. And the assistant district attorney was Harold Williams. And the defense was Fred Moore. Now, this guy was from California. He was a labor lawyer. He was at the time considered to be quite bohemian. He would sit in the courtroom in his shirt sleeves with sandals on, with socks. Even now, that's a faux pas, I think. And Judge Thayer was this buttoned-down, straight-laced Yankee. And these guys were like oil and water. They did not get along at all. And his style of lawyering was even worse. He would take naps out in the courtroom lawn during break. And he would sit there with his feet up on the table, and the judge would have to keep reminding him to get his feet off the table. So right off the bat, there's this adversarial relationship between Moore and Judge Thayer. Maybe you've heard the quote from Judge Thayer, "I'll show those anarchist bastards," later on in the trial. He wasn't talking about Sacco Vanzetti. He was talking about that bastard. Yeah. Jeremiah McInerney was the local attorney that helped out with the defense. Now, the prosecution opened up pretty much like the Plymouth trial. They introduced witnesses. Now, this is how the defense was presented. This is where they sat, in Dedham. And do you know why they don't do this anymore? What does that tell you? They're supposed to be presumed innocent. If you're in a cage, what's that saying? To get these two out of jail, because sentencing was coming. Here are some of the demonstrations. That's in Boston in front of the State House. There were petitions sent to the governor, demonstrations on a daily basis. Edna St. Vincent Millay, Albert Einstein, people like this were sending in their names on these petitions. And it all came into the lap of the governor of Massachusetts. By the way, this is what they looked like 7 years later. Both of them had ended up in Bridgewater State Hospital for mental anguish, and both of them were really haggard by this time. Sacco had pretty much given up. This was all given to Governor Alvin T. Fuller, former used car salesman. And he was a brilliant politician. He decided to kind of pass the buck. He said, I'm going to form a blue ribbon commission, and we're going to call it the Lowell Committee. Why did they call it that? They call it the Lowell Committee because it was named after the head of the committee, the president of Harvard, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, with three other men, a Eugene Aubrey Stanton, who was, I think, a professor at MIT, and a Judge Grant. Now, they were to review all the evidence, talk to all the witnesses, look at everything, and come to a conclusion. The question was, did Sacco and Vanzetti receive a fair trial? At the same time, Governor Fuller would conduct his own parallel investigation. The question was, did Sacco and Vanzetti receive a fair trial? Something was different, though. In 1927, a new invention was on the scene. Comparison microscope. They took that bullet number 3, they put it under the comparison microscope. Without a doubt, it came from Sacco's pistol. No longer was that in doubt. In the conclusion of the committee, the conclusion of Governor Fuller was that yes, indeed, Sacco and Vanzetti did receive a fair trial. And all that was left is that one bullet. The whole case hinged on that. All that was left was sentencing. Originally, the execution date was set for August 11th, 1927. But the new lawyers now, there were even a new team of lawyers, they did some maneuvering and they got a stay of execution, and then a new date was set. August 23rd, 1927. And they were to be executed at Charlestown State Prison, which is now the site of Bunker Hill Community College over in Charlestown. Now again, they thought there was going to be some big anarchist attack. They had the state troopers fully armed guarding the streets. They had mounted troopers patrolling, 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the roof of the prison. And here's a little film showing that. The state of Charlestown State Prison. Under heavy guard. They blocked off the streets. They even disconnected the electricity from the rest of the prison so the prisoners wouldn't see the lights flicker because they were afraid of a prison riot. And they had children there. I don't know why. I guess it was a day off from school. So this brings us to the night of the execution. Ironically, Celestino Medeiros would be electrocuted along with Sacco and Vanzetti. And if I can wipe my eyes here. He was the first to go. Now, Warden Henry was the warden there. They had to bring in a special executioner from Sing Sing. His name was Robert Elliott. And the three men were in their cells. Celestino Medeiros was the first to go. At 12:03, seemingly in a trance, he was guided to the chair. His arms and legs were strapped in place. A headpiece containing the electrodes was placed on the crown of his head. Then finally, the mask covering his eyes was applied. At the nod of the warden, executioner Robert Elliott, imported from Sing Sing, pulled the switch. This is a quote from the newspaper. The masked body stiffened, the mouth grimaced. In a few seconds, the witnesses noticed the smell of burning hair. 3 times, Elliot switched on the current. Then the doctor stepped forward, applied the stethoscope, and pronounced Medeiros dead. Next up was Sacco. It was 12:11 by this time. He was led to the chair. As he was being strapped in, he shouted, "Vive la anarchy! Long live anarchy." Looking around, he calmed down a little bit. And he noticed the witnesses and he explained, "Good evening, gentlemen." The electrodes had been attached, the mask applied, and Sacco shouted out, "Farewell!" The warden gave the nod to Elliot. Just as Elliot pulled down the switch, sending 2,000 volts through Sacco's body, Sacco moaned "Mother" in Italian. Shortly thereafter, he was pronounced dead. Now, Vanzetti was the last one. I should say that Vanzetti had developed somewhat of a personal relationship with Warden Henry, who was a very well-read man and very intelligent. Some people said he probably could have been a college professor had he not been wrapped up into this case, had he got an education. Henry had actually had tears in his eyes when Vanzetti came into the room at 12:20. He was escorted to the death chamber. He stood in front of the chair, facing the witnesses, and he said with great clarity, "I wish to say that I am innocent. I have never done a crime, some sins, but never any crime. I thank you for everything that you have done for me. I am innocent of all crime, not only of this one, but all. Of all. I am an innocent man." With his eyes covered by the mask, awaiting the switch, Vanzetti said, "I now wish to forgive some of those people for what they are doing to me." The penalty was administered and Vanzetti was dispatched at 12:26 a.m. That's the chair that they were executed in. It still exists today. It's in a closet in Walpole. And this is the headpiece that they both had to wear. Now, here's the headline. Nobody in Boston would take the bodies except for one funeral parlor, Langone's Funeral Parlor up on Hanover Street, which is now a real estate office. You can still see, it was Langone's up until just a few years ago. There used to be a door on this side and a door on the other, and the bodies would be kind of laying in the middle there in the parlor. And this is how people saw them. There was a line up and down Hanover Street of people filing in to see the two bodies. Years ago, when I was first giving this lecture, I had an old gentleman come up and he kind of sidled up to me and he said, "You know, I'm kind of embarrassed about this, but my friends and I, we lived in that neighborhood. When I was a kid, we bet each other how many times we could go through the line." And then he looked at me with his face and he said, "I can still remember the burn marks on their heads." There's another scene. After they wake the bodies, the funeral. These I located recently. The stuff all over their faces, plaster from the death masks that were created. And the beginning of the funeral was massive. The funeral procession, I should say. They were brought out of Langone's, supposedly over 200,000 people in the streets of Boston. Here they are loading the bodies into the hearse. Now the plan was to get to the top of Hanover Street and hang a right and head for the State House. But once they got to that juncture, there was a big long line of state police mounted saying, "No, you go that way." They kept them away from the State House. So they went through the south end of Boston, not Southie, but the south end, towards Forest Hill Cemetery. It was a rainy day. They had to go through the south end, which was mainly Irish, and people started throwing stuff out the windows at the funeral procession. By the time they got to Forest Hill Cemetery, there was about 200 people left. And this is where they held the final service for Sacco Vanzetti. And then they were cremated right here. Now, some of their ashes were sent to their families. Some are kept at the Boston Public Library. I used to know the man that was the caretaker of the Sacco Vanzetti collection. He verified that for me. And there is also a plaque that was made that's on display at the Boston Public Library. And these are some of the words that Vanzetti wrote right before he was executed. It's a bas relief. It was meant to be displayed someplace prominently in the city. For years, it was just kept in the basement someplace. And you'd be fascinated to find out who was the man that made this. Gutzon Borglum, who was the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. Now, there is a group called the Sacco Vanzetti Commemoration Group that is, they've been trying to get this plaque moved up to Hanover Street on one of the walls up there. I don't know if that's a good idea or probably disappear. But that's the state of where it is now. And this is a good place to end it. This is their death masks. I believe there's 2 copies. One is at the Boston Public Library. And I thank you for coming out tonight.